Hera McLeod, it is so great to see you again. And thank you for being here because I'm just excited to connect with you, not only because I feel like we have so much in common, but I learned so much when we talked. So thank you. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Every month should be, but you and I have talked before about a conversation that we're going to call Beyond Survival, the Untold Consequences of Leaving Abuse. And, you have your book, I have my book. Our stories are similar and so different. And I think people can learn a lot. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am so excited for this conversation. We actually tried to do it last week, but both of us, like, life was lifing, and so here we are.
Yes, I love that. And I'm really
Yeah.
thrilled that you're going to be on Persistence U in just a nanosecond, in just a couple of days. But okay, so there are a lot of things that a lot of times people have misconceptions about individuals in an abusive relationship, or when they suspect that a friend of theirs is being mistreated, or maybe a coworker. And they'll often say things, maybe well-intentioned, maybe not sometimes, but if my partner did X, Y, or Z, man, I'd leave. I'd never put up with that.
Yeah.
What is the problem with somebody sharing that kind of off-the-cuff comment to somebody who could be going through something that is unimaginable?
Well, I mean, my question to you is like, what is the most ignorant thing someone has said in that vein to you that you can remember?
There have been so many, but I will say that, and I will say that, one person said, I never expected that you would be that person who would put up with that.
Oh, ouch.
And then afterwards, somebody else followed up with, I always thought that you would have been somebody who would have had a happier life, somebody who was
Ugh.
capable of more. And, I saw things going differently for you. And in truth, so did I,
Yeah. Like, well,
but,
I wish
but
we could
that,
have both had this foresight.
right. So did I. Thanks for sharing. How about you?
Okay, so I'm gonna share with you. We had a brief chat like prior. Sorry, my dogs have no boundaries. Um, we had a brief chat prior to starting this about in a similar vein, but I 3 years ago I had been keeping my career separate from like my advocacy work, and part of the reason I did it was because of my um fear maybe and discomfort from like people, and just like because of the ignorant comments, right, and what people think about domestic violence and like who finds themselves in that situation, right. And I someone who read my book popped into my DMs on LinkedIn, and he said that he was shocked to find out that I'm a well-educated woman with a very successful career. And I don't think he like I think he probably thought he was being complimentary. Um, and yet it was so incredibly microaggressive and horrible that it was kind of an epiphany for me, where I was like, I need to connect the two. I need to come out on LinkedIn and be like, hey, like, I am a domestic violence survivor. I am a survivor of like trauma, and I'm also successful. Yes. And part of the reason I did it is because I have noticed that there is a huge lack of understanding, which I think is why Domestic Violence Month exists, like any other sort of like month that, frankly, a lot of people don't pay attention to. But what I encourage people to do is really try to figure, like, if you, before you say things like that, figure out why people aren't leaving, and how people are getting in this situation. Like, um, I think a lot of times it's ignorance that lead people to say that. And a lot of people don't think before they say anything, which is also a problem. Uh, but I also think it's like protective, right? And I think you and I have talked about this before, where like it makes people feel safer to think they are smart enough and they are a bad target. But really, at the end of the day, people who are smart, people who are attractive, people who are successful, they get targeted by bad people all the time. And just
Right.
because you are those things doesn't mean that you shouldn't be hyper vigilant and just, like, realize that this can happen to you. But I also understand that it's human to want to not be scared all the time. And so when you hear things like this, like the first thing, it's protective to be like, oh, this couldn't be me because of XYZ.
Right.
But it's also like, it is protective and also very naive and dangerous.
Right. And it does help keep individuals who are struggling, it helps them to feel very other and to feel like they can't share their truth because people wouldn't believe them. After
Exactly.
all, they don't fit the stereotype. And, you know, you and I met somebody who has a wonderful podcast, When Dating Hurts, but he has talked very openly, Bill Mitchell, about that he thought there, you know, of course this couldn't happen in my family. We live in a certain kind of neighborhood. We look a certain way. We are good people and solid family, people of faith. There's no way that would happen. And I think it's important for people to realize it is something that affects so many people and ultimately affects us all, because the people in our work world, our faith communities, our neighbors, our families are impacted by
Well, and that's
abuse.
also why I write about the topic in conjunction with my job, because I think that a lot of people are suffering in silence, and they, they like, there's this whole movement, like, bring your true self to work, but like so many of us are like, oh man, my coworkers could not handle my true self, right? But I do think that there's power in being like, hey, this is part of my experience, because I also think that one of the things that people often don't think about when they interact with others is what a trauma response looks like. And even though, you and I have both like had distance between our trauma and, have had some form of therapy and going through that, it doesn't mean that we don't have trauma responses, or like that there are certain things that would not, that could be triggering in a workplace, that I think everybody should be conscious of when they move through the world, not making assumptions about their coworkers' experiences, or things like that, and it could just be like, maybe watch what you say, or I've had situations where people think it's fun to play with Nerf guns during work, and like I was caught off guard by a Nerf gun war that was happening behind my head, and I panicked, and my coworkers were just like, they didn't understand, but it was a trauma response. I was like having a trauma response right in front of them, and I think, having more of an understanding that we are walking amongst you could potentially also help people be perhaps a little bit more empathetic and think before they do things.
Right. And like you said, some people may mean really well, but they've never had somebody come out boldly and say, hey, I have experienced this thing. And then, they may say all of the wrong things.
Yeah.
I did a webinar once, and I got a lot of people engaged in a conversation online about what do you do when someone at work is impacted? Because so often people want to just dive right in and fix things. That's the other issue of good-hearted people, but who may not have understood the dynamic of intimate partner violence and sort of tried to help and insert themselves. And of course, that could be a very, very bad idea or very dangerous.
Yeah, I also think there's a lot of misunderstandings of like also how productive you can be when you're in the middle of it, right? Because like I was in the middle of a horribly abusive relationship, and I was going to work every day, and my coworkers had no idea. And even throughout the custody case and the my son's death, like, I mean, the actual death, yeah, like everybody kind of knew like I was not okay, but like in the years that followed, I would go to different jobs and people didn't know. If they didn't Google me, they didn't know.
Right.
They didn't know that I was going through a huge trial and like all these other things. And I think sometimes, also if you do find out, not assuming that the person is at reduced capacity, because, sometimes throughout that, like I needed my job. I was like, this is what is keeping me sane right now, to be able to focus on something else. So, I think it just kind of goes back to sort of the misnomers of what people think about domestic violence.
I
But
think that's such a good point. And you referenced the fact that your son died. And I think given the fact that not everyone will have listened to our podcast together on Persistence U, I think it's important to know, to wind back for a second, to say, why could it be dangerous for someone to assume that all you need to do to get out of an abusive relationship is just leave? And I mean,
Yeah.
that's why we're here today. You did leave.
Yeah.
And so can you explain a little bit about that, that you're comfortable and you don't have to go into deep
So
detail?
I was also very naive when I was in that situation, and I left. I didn't leave soon enough. But part of the reason I didn't leave soon enough is that there was another child in the house that I didn't have custody of, that I was not going to be able to take with me. So that was one of the reasons I stayed. And I was also scared. I mean, this is a person who's like wielding his gun, and threatening me with it at any chance he gets. So I knew that in order to leave, it had to be like somewhat calculating. And I was naive enough to think like, even with that, I was like, oh, if I leave, like the authorities will be on my side. And I think the real terrifying reality is that they weren't. And there was no like societal infrastructure to protect me and my son from this person. And so people who like know this because they've either had someone close to them go through it or whatever. And then if you take it a step further, I had a lot of privilege. Like I was making my own money. I had a place to run to, like family, right? And I was a US citizen. There's women out there and men too, you know, if their situation is abusive, they don't have the privilege of just being like, I'm gonna leave, right?
Right.
And so I think it's really important to consider when people say, oh, I do this or I do that. I think it's very ignorant to say what you would do if you never have been in that situation. I got it a lot after my son died. Oh, I would have run. I would have done this and that. And I'm like, look, I get that like you think that you would not have made the same choices, but trust me, I thought about it. And I also realized that if I had, I would have been found and I would have been brought back and he would have gotten him. So like, don't pretend like I didn't have that same calculus. Like, do I wish I had run? Absolutely. Right. But I also didn't know then what I know now. Like there's a lot of, you know, you probably remember this too. It's like when you're going through this with somebody who's crazy, it's like you're trying to stay one step ahead of a crazy person and you never have all the information. Like there's no good decision. Like there's no right decision. There's no decision that doesn't come without like a load of crap. And so like running, for example, I mean, my job was here, right? Like I had to feed my child and I had to make sure that he had a place to lie his head down at night, and like running to a different country, like that wouldn't have made logical sense because I couldn't have worked. And what, like refugee status in a country that's probably going to send me back? Like, I mean, people really don't think, like they don't think they have to, they don't think about those things. They just say those comments, assuming it would be easy. There is no easy choice here.
Right. Agreed. And like you, I feel like I was naive in thinking there is a rule book out here. I will follow this rule book for victims and I won't complain too loudly and I'll be super likable, meaning, because I'm still a people pleaser, but meaning back in the day in my mid-20s, okay, I won't go back and forth to the same person. I will leave once and I will never look back at him. I won't remarry too quickly. I'll do all the right things. Get my degree, get out of the shelter that I had to stay in, get off public assistance that I had to apply for, get my kids out of counseling when they're ready. They went to play therapy. They were babies. And I felt like I did such a great job following the victim rule book.
Yeah.
And what I didn't realize was that's so funny and silly that I thought that I had control over what another person would do.
Right.
So 4 years of suffering those consequences, and my kids suffered more than anyone. And then they were taken out of country by my former husband, because after all, I was getting stronger and finally finished my degree and was starting to achieve things. And so he naturally just grabbed the kids and ran as a real strong consequence. Your son was murdered. My children were taken, and frankly, for 2 solid years out of the country, their lives were torture. And I think I just didn't ever consider, I did consider it, I did. I mean, it was fleeting thoughts, but I just thought somehow I would be immune because I was such a likable victim in my mind.
Well, I
And
also think like we can't, like when people, when my son eventually died, I remember one of the first thought I had was like, oh no, this is what I thought was going to happen. But like, I'd be lying if I said every day I even sat with that,
right,
because like you can't
right.
function if you constantly are in this place where you're like, he's gonna kill him, he's gonna take them, he's gonna, you know what I mean? Like, even though you
Exactly.
know that it's a possibility, like, you know, because you know this person enough to know that they don't play by the rules, because
Right,
really at the end of the day, that's what happened. Like, you played by the rules and he didn't have the same, like, he was not playing by the same rule book,
right,
and you didn't even have the rule book he had. Like, his
right,
whole, like, what was within the possibility, like, it wasn't even something you had access to, right? So,
right,
and it was the same with my ex. Like, I was constantly trying to figure out, like, what is his end game, right? Knowing that it was bad and fearing the worst, but also knowing, like, I can't live like this, because I also had no choice. Like, that, or there were no good choices. It was like, okay, if I do this, then this happens. If I do this, then this happens. So I was constantly in this game of like, I just need to make it to tomorrow, right?
right,
I need for Prince to make it to tomorrow. Like, um, and I think it's hard. What's hard is, and I think about this a lot, like, if I think about the difference between me as a parent to him and me as a parent to my daughters who are not in that situation, I feel incredibly guilty because I don't think it's possible to be the best version of yourself when you have that level of acute trauma going on. Um, I do think that, like, you know, parents have to give themselves grace, because like, it's not human. I mean, it's just hard, right?
right,
But I have moments like, you know, I think this goes to like the next topic we were wanting to talk about, like raising children while recovering from trauma. And I am so incredibly thankful that even though I'm recovering from trauma, I'm no longer in the acute trauma.
right.
And so I can only imagine what it was like for you to have that prolonged, like, I have to raise these children, but I'm also still in crisis, right? Because there's
Right.
like recovering from trauma phase, and then there's also the crisis phase. Um, and I will give one anecdote. When I just yesterday, actually, I was at the pumpkin patch with my kids for like a school event, and my son is buried right next to the pumpkin patch. And as painful as this is to admit, it had been years since I'd been to his grave, because I had a really hard time and have a really hard time going without it just completely sending me into a panic spiral. And so I'd been avoiding it. And so my oldest had been there and remembers being there, because my dad actually took her. I didn't even take her. But my youngest hadn't ever gone. And when we were coming from the pumpkin patch, I said to her, I said, "Oh, that's where your brother's buried." And she's like, "We have to stop. We have to go." And I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. And I was thinking of a million ways to say no. And I was like, "Well, why do you want to go?" And she was like, I want to talk to him. And I want to see
Oh,
him. And I was like, I could not refuse her. I was like, of course I have to take you, right? Um, but it was interesting because, you know, she gets out of the car, I point out where he is, and she walks up and she's super excited, and she's like, she turns to her sister and she goes, "What should we talk about? Like, what should we talk about with him?" And then she decides to take the pumpkin. She got like two little pumpkins from the patch, and she was like, we should give them to Prince. We should leave them here." And it was so sweet. And also, like, it made me realize that, like, it made me realize in that moment, like, how different I am of a mom, and how in many ways I've avoided facing certain things about how I was as a mom with him, with them, probably to my own detriment and theirs. But it was kind of that moment where like the two collided in such a way that I was like, wow, like, this is a reminder that this is part of their story, you know, and they didn't choose this. It's just part of their story.
right. Absolutely. But what a beautiful, I just think it's so beautiful that they wanted to talk to him. And also, I think that guilt that you mentioned, those pangs sometimes of like, wow, maybe this is how I feel. Like, I wish life, I look back now and I think I wish I could redo my daughter's first many years. As
Mhm.
one mentioned to me this year, and I love her to death, so it wasn't a complaint, but
Right.
she said, Mom, the first 9 years of my childhood were so awful. It's hard for me to even think about them. And it defines everything. It does. It defines everything.
Mhm.
And when I see people who are in a different situation, even single
Yeah.
parenting, if they must, raising children who aren't in that crisis mode and
Mm.
doing a better job, or if I think about myself as a parent who had kids in her 30s and in a stable relationship or whatever, and I think, oh, I wish my kids, they deserve the best.
Yeah.
And, I never had more children later on because I didn't want them to see that what life could have been. I never wanted them to be jealous. I mean, as
Yeah.
weird as that is, I think that it would have
Yeah.
been really hurtful for them because that
Yeah.
wasn't how their early, it was such a struggle and
Well,
so
and
painful.
interesting because the two girls, when we were leaving, they were talking about what life would have been like had he been here. And like the reality is like, I don't think they would have been here. Like
Right,
it's hard to like even imagine a scenario in which they all could have existed the way that they exist.
right,
And of course, I didn't even get into that with them because I was like, oh, there's this like going down a rabbit hole of like, but I think part of it is like, I don't think, I think if I had, if Prince was here, I think it would have been really hard for me to, I mean, I think we'd still be in it, right? He'd be 13 years old and I think we'd still be dealing with it. And I don't,
with his dad and
yeah,
the
we'd still be
abuse.
dealing with his dad or the, some level of chaos
Right,
associated with his dad, unless somehow his dad passed away and then it still probably the timing wouldn't have been the same. Like, so even if I had had more kids, it just wouldn't have been the same. But it was something I thought about when he was alive. Like what would happen if I had more kids and how would that be to be like, these kids don't have that experience,
right,
because I even talk to my kids about it now. Like we talk about, I think sometimes, especially for my youngest, she has a hard time with the concept of like half sibling. Like even though she has many half siblings because she's a donor conceived child. And so I think like I've been trying to make a really conscious effort to be like, you are not related to this bad person. Um, but I think what I constantly struggle with is like, how would I have explained that to my son?
right,
That would have been really hard trying to, like everything you say about this person has a possibility of making your child feel bad because this is part of their DNA. Like that is something I have not had to struggle with my daughters in,
right.
and I would have had to struggle that. I would have had that struggle with my son. Um, and I think having more kids would have made that struggle harder.
Agreed. I think often people believe who aren't in a custody battle with an abusive partner, the courts will just order lifetime supervised visitation, or the courts will definitely look at the abuse in the relationship and rule appropriately. And, it will all be okay, but that's not in practice how it works.
Mhm.
And I think not necessarily, I should say, and maybe in some courts, it may work beautifully. And I think
Yeah.
that's fantastic. But typically, it is a very difficult and tumultuous path ahead for a long period of time when a person
Yeah.
has a controlling or, someone who's exhibiting coercive control with using children as a pawn. So,
Well, I also sometimes think about parents that like when I was recovering from the worst trauma, like after my son died, I didn't have anyone else to think about, right? I didn't have to explain it to a child. I didn't have to, and I know there's people out there who have to do that, like who have another sibling in the home and they have to like, they have to like show up for that child while they're still grieving or recovering from that trauma. And I think I can relate to it because I remember sort of grieving my son while he was still alive in many ways. Um, but I think the the hard part about raising children while you're in the trauma is we also have to often balance, like, someone just on Friday told me this. They were like, you have to find ways to teach your kids that things like this exist, or like make them aware of things without traumatizing them. And as the person was saying this, I thought to myself, there's privilege in that, right? There's privilege in being able to like give your child a hypothetical scenario, or like remove yourself and your own trauma from like teaching your children. Because for someone like me and for someone like you, like our kids, it's part of their story, right?
Right.
And a type of trauma that other kids just don't have in their experience, right?
Correct.
And so as they were saying this, I was like, I get you. I understand why you might feel that way, but like there's privilege in being able to do that, you know? Like even with I watch the news a lot, which, probably isn't always the best around my kids, but um there was some footage from Israel and the war over there, and my youngest was like, oh my gosh, like, do people live there? Do kids live there? What's happening? And like it was one of those moments where I was like, what can I tell her to give her the data without making her traumatized? And then also thinking through, like, she at least has had to understand it on some level that kids die,
Right.
right? Um,
Right.
and so again, it was one of those moments where like the luxury of turning off the TV and allowing your kids to maintain that like happy sort of like childhood, I don't have to think about this. Like it's not a luxury that parents who have gone through this, or if it's part of your story, like have in the same way.
Right.
Like yes, I could make the decision not to go down that path, but I also had to balance, like, you know what, I I want her to know that like there are kids out there who are in really dangerous, scary situations and live in places that by nature of where they live or who they are, like they're not safe.
Right.
You aren't one of those children, and I'm super thankful, right? But also
Right. And
this,
we care about that, and we care, and
yeah.
we do care. When did you start your advocacy journey? And tell me the role of writing in that for you. What did that do for you to turn this horrific experience into something that could benefit other people?
Uh yeah. So we've talked about this, and for me, like I started the advocacy pretty early, like even before he was dead, because I was like, I need to scream to the mountaintops about how terrible family court was. I started under a pen name. It was called Cappuccino Queen, because I didn't want to tell people who I really was, because I was scared. I was like, if
Right.
the judges knew that I was like speaking out about what was happening, like my kid might be harmed, right? And it was the night that I found out that my son died that I finally came out and was like, hey, this is my name. My son's dead. And a lot of people had already been following, because I had been posting writing on like various sites. And so at first people were like, that didn't happen. This can't be true. Like, and I'm like, no, this actually did happen. Um, and almost immediately I was pulled into a lot of advocacy work. And I think that is, you see it all the time, like the poster moms that are like crying because their child died, and like people, in some ways, like I think some organizations can be a little bit insensitive about like where somebody is and like whether or not they're in a place to do that work. That said, I felt like in some ways I needed that. Like I needed to put my energy into something. So I shouldn't say that it was like predatory or anything, like I knew I was getting into. But it's hard, right? Because you're telling this story because you want change to happen, but every time you tell it, you're reliving it in a way, you know? And same with like, lots of people were reaching out to me on my social media platform, and they're asking me questions like, what can I do? What can I do? And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if I should give you advice because it didn't work out for me, right? Um,
Right.
but through the course of all of that, I realized like, okay, there's two things I want to do. One, I want to give the world the information I needed when I was going through it, which isn't necessarily what you'd expect. It could just be affirm my experience, make me feel not crazy when this is happening to me, and also just let me know how you coped, right? So that's one camp. The second camp is like, how can I continue to advocate for this by showing all the things that went wrong and what I think needs to happen, but do it at scale. Because me telling my story a million times is just not possible, right?
Right.
So I'm like, but I can write the book and I can share it and I can make that scale. And so part of the writing itself, yeah, it was healing in like finally just saying what, like putting down all of my thoughts into one place. But at least for me, it was more about like the protective exercise of doing it, not necessarily once, because it took me a decade to write it, but like doing it in a way that scaled so that I could also be protective of myself. So when people are asking me these things, I can be like, it's not that I don't care about you. I do. I care very deeply for you. And here's the book. And it's one of the reasons that I give away at least the audio version for free to survivors, because I'm like, I want them to have the information because it scales. Right. It's not that I don't want them to have it. It's just that like I can't get on the phone with you. Like the number of people who want me to get on the phone with them and walk them through, I mean I just can't. I can't do the free labor. Like it will kill me.
Right. Right. And I do think, and I have felt this myself, at first I wanted to Zoom with everyone who contacted me through social media or my website or whatever. And I didn't find it to be productive at all. But not only that, it's too much of a flood.
It's too
The
much.
danger also is that whatever worked for me will not necessarily work for someone else. But if I try to take on their issue and be their advocate, they're going to miss the whole point, which is one of the best things is learning to be one's own best advocate. And that takes rolling up one's sleeves and getting busy and resisting the temptation to drop the problem at someone else's feet and say, can you fix this? I've been going at this for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I used to try and to just keep up with emails and all of that. And now I feel like also, like you said, I've written a book, then I wrote a second book to talk about the skills that it needs to be their own best advocate. But I can't, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a therapist, I can't
and
do
that's
that.
the other thing. Like it's interesting. So many people ask me for legal advice. And I'm like, this is not a good decision for you to ask me this. I don't have a legal degree, right? And like I can give you my opinion, but it's not actually going to be helpful because I don't know the laws in your state. And I don't know how it's going to play out. Like, I don't know all the parties involved. I haven't looked at your documents. I can't even really give you an informed opinion.
Right.
But I also think I think one of the things that has been really hard for a lot of people to understand, which is baffling to me because I think it should be obvious, but like asking someone for free labor when you know, or at least should know that like doing the labor is going to be taxing to them is like crazy to me.
Right.
Not to say that I like expect to be rich from this data, but it's like it's work, right? So like the time I'm spending talking to you on the phone or giving you my opinion is time that I'm not with my kids or time when I'm not doing my real job that's actually paying for my house, right? So I think that, I think that's also why I've noticed a lot of survivors have started to be coaches. It's not a path I took because I don't have the capacity and I don't actually think, there's professional development that I don't have that I did. And it's not necessarily something that was like in my, I don't know. I maybe didn't feel like it would be the most effective use of my talents.
Right.
But I get it when people do it because they're probably like, I'm tired of doing this for free. And at least I can, profit off of this. But for me, I'm a writer, like I wrote before Prince died and I wrote in the decade. I write op-eds, I write on LinkedIn, I write, and I wrote my book and it's like, it's a cheaper form of coaching, right?
Right.
Than if I were to pay hourly, like, I don't know. I just don't know if it would be cost effective for people for the advice.
It can also really be cathartic to write and to put yourself in the position of the people you're writing about and to get to know certain things better. It really can be empowering to use your voice in that way. What
Yeah.
would you say to someone who it wants to be, like, what do you think would be important for someone who's thinking about being an advocate? Maybe it's a survivor and they want to go that extra step.
Yeah.
What would you
I think
suggest?
one of the things I recommend as a number one is you have to get to an emotional place where you can handle it. And you can come across credible. Like in the decade and change since my son died, I've noticed, I've done a lot of advocacy for like local legislative changes and also some federal work, just for getting the word out, to legislators. And I've noticed that there are a lot of people who feel like they need to jump into it, and I get that it might make them feel better. But if you are still having sort of acute trauma and you haven't healed to a certain degree, you don't come across as credible because you're still having trauma responses. And I think in order to actually effectively make a change, your message has to resonate with the people who aren't going to get it, that you're having a trauma response, you know?
Right.
Um, but I also think, I don't know. I mean, I've seen a lot of like, I saw a 16-year-old, or she was actually 15 at the time, testify in front of Maryland legislator about what it was like to be given back to her abusive father, knowing like the abuse and the anxiety she lived with, worrying about him getting out of jail and then having to go through it again. And I was insanely impressed with this kid because I was like, you are in it and you are still here, like articulately reading your story. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying that
Right.
like I think if someone wants to do that effectively while also being self-protective, it's really important to have that infrastructure in place to have a therapist. I mean, I just saw my therapist today and like I see her
Mhm.
every week, and there's no end in sight, right? I don't think I'm ever going to have a point where I'm like, I think I'm done with therapy. Uh,
Right.
so yeah, I think just finding ways to create boundaries and being mindful of what it does to you. Like, but I wonder, like, how about you? Like, what do you think? What do you think people need to be mindful of?
If they're thinking about being an advocate, I mean, I think I left my husband in 1990. And by the time 1992, almost 2.5 years later, came, I'd done a lot of therapy. My kids had done play therapy. And I went smack into work as a domestic abuse survivor advocate. Great staff, great people, loved the work. But for some reason, I was still kind of young in my brain. I thought to myself, see, I'm done. I've arrived. I'm helping other people and that with the same thing, not
Mhm.
realizing that my own situation, though we were long divorced, was continuing to escalate. So
Yeah,
I would say staying, I never hesitate to go to therapy. Love it. I
yeah,
think some sort of support, peer support group is always invaluable also, because
yeah,
we can learn so many things and gain a perspective that is otherwise impossible by listening to the stories of others. But it's really important also to know what our boundaries are when we're starting to want to do some advocacy work
yeah,
and to figure out like how deep do I want to go in. And I still struggle when I meet as somebody who survived something horrific. I wish I could just change it for them, but I can't. And so just reminding myself and making sure that I stay in check, that I'm not working harder at someone's issue that they're dealing with than they are. And not forgetting that what is so important is the belief that every person has it within themselves to be their own best advocate. And so
yeah,
it's wonderful to augment their efforts and to be a voice or to help them at a time when they're vulnerable, only for a short period of time while they are regaining their strength in a way they may have not known possible before.
yeah. That's helpful. And I do think that like there are like a therapist isn't necessarily like the be all end all for everyone, but I do think that like making sure you have some support system in place is super important because
Definitely.
I think what I've noticed throughout the course of the last decade is like there were definitely moments where I was pouring out so much and I wasn't getting anything back.
Right.
And I think we can like burn ourselves out really hard by doing that. And I think, at least for me, one of the reasons I advocate is it's how I parent my son. And so it makes me feel like I'm doing something for him because I can't parent him in the traditional way. And so by advocating for other kids, it's how I do that. But I also have to be really conscious that I can't like I have to create boundaries in
Sure.
how much time and energy and efforts, and also make sure that I can um, kind of take a pulse on like how am I doing with this? Am I feeling like I can take this on? And I do remember in the very beginning, and interestingly, like people in my family noticed. They were like, "I think you need some distance from this."
Mm.
And I didn't want to hear it because I was like, "No, like I need this. I need to do this." And I think what they were really saying is not that you shouldn't do this, but you probably need to figure out what your boundaries look like and be able to recognize in yourself when you need a break.
I like that. Yes, absolutely. I think that is so incredibly important. The other important thing too is once you got your boundaries, you've gone through a period of healing,
Mhm.
of the intense crisis, and it doesn't mean you won't still have trauma or that you don't incorporate it, but you've created a life that's very fulfilling. You know, you have still a
Mhm.
wonderful career, advocacy work, your
Mhm.
children, all of the things, you know, your wonderful support. It is possible for people to know I mean, I think it's important for people to know this is the worst of life isn't your whole life.
Yeah,
And
like it
you know, it
certainly
is
doesn't
not your whole
apply.
life. And so there is a possibility of joy in the future. And when I see you, I'm always like, you know, you're so energetic and fun. And, you know, I really appreciate, not that life is always like that, but you've done a great job of moving forward and
Oh,
showing to your kids, this is not the end just because something unthinkable, the worst
yeah.
thing ever could happen, doesn't mean that life stops.
Yeah, and I try to be conscious about that too, because I mean, I will always think like the best revenge is living your best life, right? Because I am sure that when my ex had whatever harebrained idea or plan he came up with for all of this was not what he envisioned my life
Right.
to look like. And he hoped that he could bury me, right? He wanted to destroy me completely. And I think I just, I proved that he was incapable of doing that. Like he just didn't have that power. He certainly took a lot from me, and I will live with the after effects of him doing that. But he didn't destroy me as a person. He didn't make it so that I couldn't like keep going and do, like live a fulfilling life. Um,
Right.
but I do think at the same time, like I don't think by any stretch of the imagination my life is perfect. And I think that
Sure.
I mean, I talk to my therapist on the regular about like things and ways that, my experiences sort of seep into my life, and um there's certainly room for improvement. I think what I struggle with is wanting to eventually get to a point where I'm having like a healthy romantic relationship, but then also being intensely terrified of it, just in
Mhm.
full transparency. And I think this is a normal reaction for having gone through this level of trauma. Um, and I've dated since, so it's not like I don't date. It's just I think that it's very real to be like, yes, I have a very fulfilling life, and I made the conscious decision to never co-parent again, and I feel very strongly about that no matter what. But I also identify that like I have work to do to make sure that I like do actually find a healthy partner one day, to also make sure that my kids have that, have that to look at. It's like, oh wow, like this is, look at my mom, she's so happy in this relationship and this person
Mm.
treats her well. Like, I mean, that's something that's missing from our lives right now, right?
Sure.
Um, but yeah, like I'm hopeful, like I know it eventually will happen. It's just, I think people always have to sort of give themselves a break, because like you can't have it all at once, and you have to
Right.
realize like,
And as I like to think for myself, that, you know, not everyone is geared toward having one long-term forever and ever relationship. I don't believe, you know, some people believe every person has a soulmate. I'm not sure I believe that or that we're all geared for that. I have a dear friend who once told me, don't feel bad about it. Some people have shorter seasons of love. But I will say also that my
yeah.
kids in their 30s, so they're in their mid 30s, have mentioned, not infrequently, probably every couple of years, one of them will bring up the fact that it is a huge disappointment that I never did recouple. And someone who could have been a stepfather to them, that was something that was very important. And they don't say it as a blaming thing, but just being very honest. They're like, that is hugely sad because we wanted a father and they're important. And we didn't really get one with the person who, is our dad.
I don't know, like, I'm sure my kids, like, I feel like kids are gonna be on the couch for something, and mine will probably be like, Mom, like, why didn't you marry or whatever? I don't know that I want to be married.
Right.
I won't say never because I feel like that's probably perhaps too binary and I don't know what the future will bring. But I think for me, it's more about getting to a point where I can have happy, healthy relationships and like, I mean, I don't necessarily think there's one person for everyone. I think there's probably a lot of people who could be really good matches. Because I think if I bought into the like, is there one for everyone? I would be probably more pessimistic than I am about finding love. Because I'd be like, well, holy hell, there's a lot of people on the planet, and like, what if mine like lives in Gaza right now? Like, we're screwed. Like, we're never right. And I know that probably is like a really flippant, terrible thing to say about the current situation, but like, you know what I mean? Like, if there was one person, right? Especially since like we make so many decisions in life that like could just take you away from like that one person. So I don't believe that's true. I think there are many people with whom we could be very compatible. I think for me, it's also like recognizing, and I think this is probably the true in some sense for everyone, but like recognizing we all make choices. And so I can't sit here and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so unlucky in life. Like I'm making a conscious choice to not put myself out there as much as I could be.
Right.
But that's also probably like in response to trauma. So like, so I say that to say, like, I think a lot of people, will say like, oh, this happened to me. And like, that's why I don't have the job of my dreams, or that's why I don't have this or that. And like, I think that's like probably letting yourself off too easily. And in my situation, like I have just in this season of my life, I've prioritized my career and I prioritized my children. Like I knew I wanted children and I wanted children more than I wanted the relationship at that time. And my kids will always be more important to me than like a romantic relationship. And same goes for you. Like you knew you wanted to be there for your kids in a way that like perhaps going and putting yourself out there like would have taken away from that energy. And even though they think they wanted that or they think they would have wanted that, like there's a reason why it didn't happen. And it was like a conscious choice, or
and like you, I dated, I did date, and there were times where I dated really hardcore, like I was, on a mission, and I met nice people. It wasn't that there was a lack of good men out there. There were some wonderful people. It just in the back of my mind is always, what is this person going to do? So
yeah, that's the problem. And that's why I'm telling you, people have to go to therapy, because I think that is what we all sort of need to grapple with and move past. Because it's also not fair to like do to a future partner to be like, oh, like you must be a psychopath too. Like, we all have to believe that that's not like the majority of people. But I also think it's hard. I mean, for me at least, like I met my ex online, and right now, like app dating is so prevalent, and I had to get to the point where I told my therapist the other day, I was like, I just can't do it. Like, I get why people do it. I love that for them. It's just, it's not ever going to be the way I meet my person. And if it has to be the way I meet my person, then I'm just going to have to be okay with being single. Because I can't get past that. So yeah, I'm in a season where I'm like working on other options, or like, what can I do to like put out in the world that I'm open to this, but just perhaps not via an app. So all you men out there, you will not find me on the app, because I have realized that it's just not happening. So I don't know, you have to like bump me at the bar or the restaurant or whatever, like be brave, but
well, I'm so incredibly glad that we got to have this conversation. Remind people, I mean, I know our interview together on Persistence U podcast will be out, but you have a book. Can you just mention the title of your book and where people can find, connect with you and your work. And I don't mean a DM or an email that you
No,
won't have
no.
time to return, but I just mean, find out more about your work and public speaking, advocacy, all of that.
Well, you can go to my website. It's www.heramcleod.com. It was very hard to actually get my own domain name, which is a whole story in and of itself, maybe for another time. Go there. You can find information about my book. The book is called Defying Silence, a memoir of a mother's loss and courage in the face of injustice. And you can find it anywhere. You can go to your local indie store and ask them to order one for you. You could go to Amazon, and I have it in both print, Kindle version, and or ebook version, and also in audio. I will apologize in advance for the audio because I did it by myself. And
Good job. Good job. That's not
recorded it by
easy.
myself. But there's a reason for it. I wanted everyone to feel like they were sitting down with me and a cup of coffee while I told my story. So
I love it. It takes a lot of courage, and you did that, and that does scale. So if people want to know, your journey and understand all that it took, that is a great way to share it. And
well,
I'm
and I
just
will
so
talk to people. Like if you want to hop into my DM, just read the book first, right?
right.
If you have specific questions after you've read the book, more than happy to chat with people. It's not that I'm not, I just really I don't have the bandwidth, and I'm also not the best person to ask legal advice to, but I am good at like connecting people who maybe could help, like organizations and such. So if people have like quick questions like that, I'm more than happy to help people.
Well, speaking of which, and it's probably good to put a couple of resources out there. And I will just say that I feel it's important for people to look for resources. I personally get contacted to find specific names of people who helped me when that was like so long ago, and they are not in a position to do those things any longer. But the general resources are very important for people to know. So things like domesticshelters.org, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, places like that. Think of another, if we're talking about supervised visitation, there's the Supervised Visitation Network where you are on the board of directors. So information about child custody issues and abuse, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, even for people who are concerned that their spouse may take their child and run, they can get free information and pamphlets to put up preventative measures.
Yeah, I will also add, like a lot of people want to know about how they can get low bono or pro bono support for family court cases. I would recommend an organization called Child Justice Inc. I know that they do some pro bono work and some low bono work, and they also they're based in the DC area, but they do have connections with other nonprofits nationally that they connect people with. I would also recommend people leverage some of the law universities because they have legal clinics for domestic violence. And, it's not like having, putting an attorney on the bankroll, but you could get some help through that. And it would be likely in a pro bono situation. And it's definitely better than trying to represent yourself. I would also recommend, sometimes there's like good legal clinics that you can go to locally through organizations, like some charitable organizations. And sometimes it's helpful just to go like ask some questions to someone that you're not spending $250 an hour to deal with. So those are helpful. DV Leap is another organization. It used to be based out of George Washington Law School.
What was it called again?
It's called DV and then Leap, LEAP.
Okay.
And so they run it's called Domestic Violence Legal Empowerment and Appeals Project. So they often handle cases on appeal. So like, if you can get them to take your case, like it would be amazing because they have lots of resources and are a nonprofit organization. So
I think what you said about finding those other resources that people don't think about is incredible. But if a person does go, and I had to do this, when you go to, let's say, your local legal aid, and you sit through maybe a free workshop, if you're lucky, they have a free workshop of some sort. Whatever the agency asks a person to do, even if they say, well, that information's not going to help me, I'm not going to do that. No. I personally encourage people to take that first recommendation because people invest more when they realize that you're serious and you're listening to what they're saying. That was a big part of why I wrote the second book, was like, I feel like so often people just want to have that private lawyer for free,
Mhm.
but often there are hoops that you have to jump through to be able to connect with the people. And when people see that you're willing to do that,
Yeah.
the world opens up quite a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the hard part is that, I mean, I tell people all the time, ain't nothing free, right? So like you either decide you're to rub some money on it if you have money to rub on it, and then you can like sort of take a back seat. So like if you think about yard work, for example, I am fortunate enough and privileged enough to be able to rub some money on it and have somebody else cut my lawn. But if I didn't have the money, I couldn't just sit there and be like, who's going to do this for free? I'd have to get out there and cut my own lawn, right? Like
Right.
there just ain't nothing free. Like you can't you're gonna have to pay for something. Or I maybe bake the neighborhood kid some cookies or something, but it's still not free because you're still doing
Right.
something. And I think the same goes for getting legal resources, because nobody's gonna know your case as well as you do. And even the attorneys that you hire don't know your case as well as you do. So finding those opportunities to get the information. One thing I will also say that is a little known fact that I wish I knew when I was going through it, there are a lot of companies that provide for a small extra fee a month, like legal services coverage. And a lot of people assume that it's like, legal services for some innocuous thing that you might encounter in your life. But I actually know people who have used and leveraged their that work benefit for child custody stuff. They might still have to pay a little bit extra out of pocket, but it could be vastly cheaper than dropping $150,000 in 1 year, which is what I did. So I would, if you have an employer benefit that includes any sort of legal representation or legal connection, I would just encourage people to look into it and see what it covers, because paying an extra like $15 a month is like, I mean, that could save you a lot of money.
I love that. Such good advice. And I didn't have that kind of benefit until my very final job when I no longer needed it.
Yeah.
But what a beautiful resource. So good point. Like looking at our local, what do we already have, and taking an inventory of that is probably really important before we decide to map out a plan for change. So good idea. Thank you. And thanks so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it, as well as your interview on Persistence U. This was fabulous, Hera. This was such good information. I think, again, it will scale. This is a way to reach people.
So too. And I'm excited. I'm excited for people to hear it. And, hopefully people use this opportunity in this month to educate themselves about domestic violence and try to leverage some of the resources. So even if you're not going through it, like someone in your life probably is going through it or might go through it, or you might go through it yourself. So take this opportunity when you're not in the middle of chaos to learn about what's going on and all the different angles, and get the resources so that you can be more knowledgeable.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to you. Thanks to you too.
Okay, let me